it's a real conundrum. So, when we talk, I should say that not everyone describes blended finance with the same understanding of what it is.
Yes, this
And
is
I
true.
have been in rooms where I was talking for quite a long time about blended finance, only to realize that no one else used the same definition I did. So if we could talk about blended finance as an approach, as opposed to an asset class, and it's an approach, and I think I would agree with how you've described it, but let me just sort of put a pin in this. Financing that actually deliberately chooses investors with different expectations of return. Now, and as a result, you need to stack those investment expectations and risk. And it may be that it's private-public partnerships. It may be that it's got philanthropic capital. It may be that it just has different investors with different investor appetites. Sometimes people who talk about blended finance say, well, it has to have public money and private money. I'm actually using a somewhat different orientation, because I think at the end of the day, what matters is who's taking what risk, who's putting what type of pressures on the financial return, and who's putting pressure on the impact return. And if what we're saying is the way to get to scale and the way to move this field forward is to bring different types of investor expectations and interests to the table, we get to this thorny point. Because the very thing that could help us get to scale can also be the components that break down over time. Because most blended finance approaches, the day they sign the document, everybody's happy, or they wouldn't have been signing. They all feel very good about how their interests are being addressed, how their expectations have been memorialized, hopefully at some level in the agreements, and then the world happens, and the exogenous events occur, and the things outside of the control of any of the parties start to happen, and all of a sudden you can start to see the expectations that were in place at the beginning come under stress, and so one of the things I've started doing, so I'll sort of give a nod to this incomplete contracting point that you made earlier. Even in a blended finance approach, I would almost say, particularly in a blended finance approach, our contracts are probably more incomplete than what you would see in a commercial deal. Because in a commercial deal, the incompleteness is somewhat boxed by the fact that everybody knows the kind of financial return that's expected. And what they're trying, the incompleteness is what could get in the way of that financial return. But because we're bringing multiple return expectations, multiple types of return expectations, and the investors themselves may have a different view of what they are going to get out of the deal, you can imagine the level at which COVID, a cyclone, think of the things that could happen in the world, can come in, and all of a sudden, all of that closely aligned, we all wanted to do this, gets shakier and shakier. So this question is, people have been, lawyers, appropriately so, have been criticized in this space for over-documenting, having the documentation overwhelm this deal size. And that is a real problem. The lawyering of that kind of complexity is hard to do. So what I've seen people starting to do, and I can't say I'm seeing it everywhere, but I am seeing evidence of it, is deliberate incompleteness, where people are saying, okay, you have one goal for this, Deborah, you have another goal for this, someone else out there has yet another goal, but you all think that you're enough on the same page that you could come together into a deal and put your money on the table. And so what they're starting to do is they're saying, okay, so how are we going to fill the gaps? Because we can't think of everything that could go wrong. We can't do rule-based contracting here because we don't have enough rules for all the things that could happen. So let's just embrace the fact that things are going to happen that we didn't see coming. And let's put some other mechanisms into our relationship that require lots of check-ins, lots of data flow, really is limiting information asymmetry, is really trying to get everyone informed at the same time on the same stage as to what's happening and making decisions together about what's happening. I call that contractual governance. Not waiting till something goes wrong, but socializing it as you're negotiating, socializing it as you're now living in the documentation that's in place so that people aren't surprised and they can build in for themselves whatever flux or flex they need in order for this investment to work. So yesterday, so timely, an article of mine just came out that I wrote with Louise Savelle of Social Finance, and it was about building relational contracts in the funding agreements for social enterprises. And we took a look at what happened during COVID to some of the outcome-based financing that Louise is so expert in, and which often have these contractual governance provisions. These are outcome-based. These are transactions that prioritize outcome, and the financial return is dependent upon the outcome. The more outcome you get, impact outcomes you get, the more money an investor gets. So it's actually a positive correlation as opposed to the trade-off that you sometimes see in impact investing. And we thought, well, how did they manage? And what we saw was more resilient contracts. The contracts didn't break. The relationships didn't break. People were able to pivot because of this constant flow of information, because a lot of time had been spent at the beginning of the negotiation talking about why people were going into the deals and what meant the most to them and what their limitations were, what the boundaries were of their own flexibility. I mean, a lot of that work was done up front and then found a way to be held. And sometimes it was formally introduced into the documentation. Sometimes it was in a separate piece of paper. So that's a big question. How formally do you set up these relational contracts? But they fill the gaps and they move you from a rule-based decision-making process to a relationship value-based decision-making process. I would say that's more important for blended finance approaches than any, because that is where things can go off the rails.
Mm-hmm.